The merciless Texas sun blazed overhead, like a furnace door thrown wide, casting wavering heat mirages across the packed earth of Pratt Ranch. Clara's knees struck the ground with brutal force, as Foreman Buck Hawthorne's calloused grip released her shoulder, sending up a choking cloud of dust that mingled with the sweat and dried blood, streaking her bruised face. Her ribs throbbed from the morning's beating punishment for dropping Mrs. Pratt's china pitcher while scrubbing the main house floors on trembling, exhausted arms. "Look at this pitiful creature." Hawthorne's gravelly voice boomed across the ranch yard, drawing curious stares from field hands pausing in their work. His weathered face, marked by decades of frontier cruelty, twisted into an expression of pure disgust as he towered over Clara's crumpled form. "Can't even manage house chores without stumbling around like a lame foal. Too weak to carry a basket of laundry 10 yards without her knees buckling." Clara pressed her palms against the scorching earth, pushing herself upright on arms that shook like autumn leaves. At 19, she'd already endured 3 months of this living hell since arriving at the ranch as a desperate orphan, willing to accept any work that might keep starvation at bay in the endless wilderness. Her slight frame had never been built for the backbreaking demands of frontier life, but she'd thrown herself into every task with fierce determination. "Please, Mr. Hawthorne," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the buzz of flies and the distant lowing of cattle. "I can do better. Just give me another chance." His boot connected with her ribs like a sledgehammer blow, rolling her sideways into the dirt. Several workers winced and looked away, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. "Keep your mouth shut, girl. Mrs. Pratt's sick of your excuses and broken dishes." He gestured with obvious contempt toward the weathered stables that reeked of manure and unwashed horseflesh. "You want to work like an animal, you can live with the animals. Mucking stalls, hauling feed sacks, cleaning up horse shit, that's all your worthless hide is good for now." From within the nearest stall came the explosive sound of iron-shod hooves striking wood. The wild Mustang Mrs. Pratt had purchased from Mexican traders reared up on its hind legs, nostrils flaring as it sensed the violence in the air. The magnificent creature's coat gleamed like polished copper, but its eyes rolled white with barely contained fury and terror, a mirror of the savage desperation that ruled this place. Standing motionless in the shadows between 2 stalls was Eli Mercer, 22 years old with gentle brown eyes beneath the frayed brim of a hat that had weathered too many brutal seasons. His right leg bore permanent damage from an injury that had shattered both bone and his prospects for decent employment elsewhere. He gripped a hand-carved mesquite walking stick, saying nothing as he witnessed Clara's humiliation, but his jaw muscles tightened with each blow she received. "That's enough entertainment for today," called out Jake Morrison, a grizzled cowhand with silver whiskers. "Some of us got cattle to move before this heat gets worse." "Mind your own business, Morrison." Hawthorne snarled, but he stepped back from Clara. "Unless you want to join her in the stables." Jake spat a stream of tobacco juice and turned away, muttering under his breath. "Ain't right treating folks like that. My old granddaddy would have horsewhipped a man for less." Other workers began dispersing, unwilling to risk Hawthorne's unpredictable temper. Only Eli remained pretending to adjust a bridle while keeping Clara in his peripheral vision. He'd lived at the Pratt Ranch for 4 brutal years, ever since a Mustang had crushed his leg during a roundup on another spread down in Laredo. No other rancher wanted a crippled hand, and Mrs. Pratt paid him in table scraps and stable space for work that kept him invisible and forgotten by the outside world. Clara struggled to her feet, her simple cotton dress torn and stained with dirt and crimson. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and her left eye was already swelling shut. Where am I supposed to sleep?" "With the horses," Hawthorne replied with evident satisfaction. "Maybe sleeping in horse shit will teach you some humility about your place in this world." He shoved a splintered pitchfork into Clara's trembling hands, the rough wood immediately opening fresh cuts on her palms. Start with the back stalls and work your way forward. I want every inch of this stable clean enough for Sunday church by sundown." As the foreman stomped away, his spurs jangling with each step, Clara stood alone in the stable entrance. The overwhelming stench of manure, hay, and animal sweat made her stomach lurch, while the magnitude of her degradation crashed over her like a wave. The Mustang continued pacing in its reinforced pen, occasionally striking the wooden planks with thunderous force. Its wild eyes seemed to recognize a kindred spirit in Clara, another creature trapped by forces beyond its control. "Easy there, Storm." Eli's quiet voice drifted from a nearby stall where he was grooming a gentle mare. "Save your strength for when it matters." Clara looked toward him with surprise. "Storm, that's what I call him." Eli explained, his tone carefully neutral. "Mrs. Pratt just calls him the Mustang, but every creature deserves a name." He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "You'll want to stay clear of his pen. He's kicked 2 men into next week since he got here." The second day dawned with no relief from the crushing heat. By mid-morning, Clara's hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the rough pitchfork handle, her back screaming in agony as she hauled wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of reeking manure to the compost heap behind the stables. The relentless sun pressed down like a physical weight, making her dizzy and nauseated. "Keep moving, girl," growled Pete Kowalski, one of Hawthorne's lieutenants, as he passed by leading a string of horses to water. "Foreman sees you resting, he'll tan your hide good." Clara nodded weakly, not trusting her voice. When she finally stumbled to the water trough near Storm's pen, her legs gave out completely. She collapsed beside it, her vision swimming with black spots as heat exhaustion began claiming her consciousness. The cool metal against her burning cheek felt like salvation itself. "Get up." Hawthorne's voice cracked like a whip across the stable yard. "I don't pay you to lounge around like some pampered city lady." "Please." Clara gasped, struggling to push herself upright on arms that had no strength left. "Just need a moment to... You'll get water when the work's finished. Not 1 second before." His hand moved to the coiled whip at his belt, fingers stroking the braided leather with obvious anticipation. "Get back to those stalls or you won't eat tonight. Hell, you might not eat tomorrow either." From the shadows at the far end of the stable came the soft sound of boots on straw. Eli appeared around the corner, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid aggravating his damaged leg. In his weathered hands, he carried a dented canteen and what appeared to be half a loaf of bread wrapped in clean cloth. "Mr. Hawthorne sent me to check the west pasture fence for breaks," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone long accustomed to avoiding trouble. "Said he won't be back for an hour or more." It was an obvious lie, and they all knew it. But Hawthorne had already turned his attention to berating another worker across the yard, his voice rising in another tirade about laziness and incompetence. Eli knelt carefully beside Clara, his movements gentle as he pressed the warm canteen into her trembling hands. "Drink slow and steady," he whispered urgently. "Too fast and you'll bring it all back up." The water tasted of metal and had been warmed by the sun, but to Clara, it might as well have been the finest wine. She drank carefully, feeling life gradually return to her parched throat and cracked lips. Eli broke the bread in half and offered her the larger portion, his eyes constantly scanning for Hawthorne's return. "I can't take your food," she protested weakly, though her stomach cramped with hunger. "I've got more stored away." Eli lied smoothly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "You need strength for what's coming. This place, it breaks people who aren't careful." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Eli was already rising to his feet, shouldering his walking stick with practiced ease. "Rest another minute, then get back to work. Can't have him thinking I'm helping you too much." But Hawthorne's eyes missed nothing. He materialized from behind a supply wagon like a predator emerging from tall grass, his face flushed with rage and something deeper, a sadistic pleasure at catching them in their small act of human kindness. "Well, well, well." He drawled, his voice dripping with false sweetness as he flexed the whip in his scarred hands. "Look what we got ourselves here. The crippled stable boy playing nursemaid to our newest charity case." Eli stepped protectively in front of Clara, though his damaged leg made his stance unsteady at best. "She was overheated, Mr. Hawthorne. Dead workers don't get much done." The whip cracked across Eli's chest with the sound of lightning splitting oak, opening his threadbare shirt and the skin beneath in a line of bright crimson. He stumbled backward, but didn't fall, gripping his walking stick with white-knuckled determination. "Iker, you don't give orders here, boy." Hawthorne's voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than his earlier shouting. "Maybe it's time somebody reminded you exactly what your place is on this ranch." What followed was methodical, calculated brutality designed as much for the audience as for the victims. Hawthorne dragged Eli into the center of the stable yard where every worker could see, then proceeded to demonstrate with surgical precision what happened to those who showed mercy in his domain. Each crack of the whip sent the horses into greater agitation, their whinnies and frantic stamping creating a symphony of terror that echoed off the wooden walls. Storm reared and plunged in his pen, his iron shoes striking the reinforced planks with explosive force that made the entire structure shudder. "Let this be a lesson to all of you." Hawthorne called out between lash strokes, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Kindness is weakness. Weakness gets people killed out here." Clara forced herself to watch every moment of Eli's punishment, memorizing the sound of leather on flesh, the way his face went pale as parchment, but never once begged for mercy or cried out in pain. When it was finally over, Hawthorne left Eli bleeding in the dirt and walked away without another word, whistling a jaunty tune. "Get him some water," old Jake Morrison whispered to Clara as he passed by, careful to keep his voice low. "Can't do it myself. Hawthorne's got his eye on me already." That night, as additional punishment for receiving help, Clara was forced to sleep on loose hay in an empty stall instead of the workers' bunkhouse. The stable walls creaked and groaned around her alive, with the restless sounds of horses disturbed by the day's violence. Storm paced endlessly in his pen just 15 feet away, occasionally hammering his hooves against the wooden planks with sharp, thunderous impacts that made her flinch. "Can't sleep either." Eli's voice came softly from the darkness. He'd managed to drag himself to his usual sleeping spot in the tack room, though every movement clearly cost him dearly. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear that whip." Clara whispered back, "How do you stand it here?" There was a long pause before Eli answered. "Some places mark you on the outside. Others mark you on the inside. Question is which kind of scars you can live with." Around midnight, Storm's agitation reached a critical point. The Mustang had been growing more frenzied with each passing hour, driven to madness by the lingering smell of blood and fear that permeated the stable air. One of the fence boards, already weakened by his earlier kicking and further loosened by years of weather and neglect, finally gave way, with a sharp crack that split the night like a gunshot. The magnificent animal burst through the opening like a force of nature, unleashed his copper coat, gleaming in the moonlight, streaming through the stable doors. 1,200 pounds of terrified horseflesh thundered directly past Clara's makeshift bed, the wind from his passage lifting her hair and filling her lungs with a wild scent of freedom. She pressed herself frantically against the stall wall, her heart hammering, as Storm crashed through the stable doors and disappeared into the star-filled darkness beyond. His hoofbeats gradually faded into the distance, leaving behind only the settling sounds of disturbed horses and the whisper of night wind through broken boards. Eli appeared within moments, moving as quickly as his injured leg would allow. His shirt was torn and stained with dried blood from the whipping, but his eyes were alert and focused despite the obvious pain each step caused him. "You hurt?" he asked quietly, helping Clara to her feet with gentle hands. She shook her head, still too shaken to speak coherently. Together, they surveyed the damage in the pale moonlight, splintered boards, an empty pen, and the unmistakable knowledge that come morning there would be hell to pay for this disaster. "We could run." Clara whispered the words, tumbling out before she could stop them. "Both of us. Right now, while everyone's asleep." Eli's smile was sad, but understanding. "Where would we go? I can barely walk 5 miles on this leg, and you don't know the country. We'd be dead of thirst or snake bite before we reached the next town." Dawn brought Hawthorne's fury like an approaching thunderstorm. He stood over Clara and Eli in the ruined stable, his face purple with rage as he took in the destroyed fence, scattered hay, and most importantly, the empty pen where $500 worth of prime Mustang should have been. That animal was worth more than both your miserable lives put together. He roared, spittle flying from his lips. "Mrs. Pratt paid good money for that horse, and now it's running wild because of your criminal negligence." The fence was already weakened. Eli said quietly, his voice steady despite the obvious pain speaking caused him. "Yesterday's disturbance spooked all the horses. It was only a matter of time before—" "Shut your lying mouth." Hawthorne's open hand cracked across Eli's face with the sound of a branch snapping, reopening the cuts from the previous day's whipping. "You two have exactly until sunset to bring that Mustang back alive and unharmed, or you're both off this ranch without a cent of the wages you're owed." Clara felt ice water flood her veins. Being dismissed without pay was tantamount to a death sentence in this harsh country, where the nearest settlement lay a full day's ride through scorching desert and rocky canyons filled with rattlesnakes, coyotes, and worse. Mrs. Evangeline Pratt herself emerged from the main house to assess the situation, drawn by the commotion and the potential loss of valuable livestock. She was a woman in her middle 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes like chips of winter ice. She'd built her considerable fortune by viewing every living creature as either an asset to be exploited or a liability to be eliminated, with no room whatsoever for sentiment between those two stark categories. "Foreman Hawthorne is being more generous than you deserve," she said, her cultured voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "In most frontier towns, horse thieves face a hanging rope. Here you're getting a chance to prove you're worth the food you've consumed and the shelter you've occupied." The implicit threat needed no elaboration. Fail to recover the Mustang, and they would face something far worse than simple dismissal. They'd be branded as thieves and face frontier justice accordingly. "We'll find him," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We'll bring Storm back." Mrs. Pratt's eyebrows rose slightly at the name. "Storm, you've been naming my livestock like pets." Her laugh was cold as winter wind. "How perfectly appropriate. Just remember the animal returns unharmed, or you both disappear into the desert. Permanently." Eli gathered his meager tracking equipment with practiced efficiency, born of years working cattle drives, a coiled rope, a bucket of oats for bait, his carved walking stick, a small folding shovel, and most importantly, a battered canteen that he filled from the well. Clara watched him prepare, noting how he favored his injured shoulder along with his permanently damaged leg. "I know where Storm likely headed," he told her quietly as they prepared to set out across the brutal landscape. "Horses always run toward water when they're frightened, and there's a seasonal stream about 6 miles west through the canyon country. Problem is getting there and back before dark with enough time to actually catch him." The terrain stretching before them was unforgiving. In the extreme, a maze of thorny mesquite bushes, jagged limestone rocks, and deep gullies carved by flash floods that could break a horse's leg or a person's neck with equal ease. The sun was already climbing steadily, promising to turn the air into a shimmering furnace that would suck moisture from their bodies with every labored breath. "Tell me about the horse," Clara said as they began walking. "What makes him special enough for Mrs. Pratt to pay so much?" "Storm's what the Mexicans call cimarron, truly wild, never broken by human hands." Eli explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone who understood and respected such creatures. "Most horses we work with were born domestic, maybe got loose for a while. But Storm's bloodline goes back to Spanish conquistadors, pure desert survival stock. A horse like that, properly trained, could carry a man 100 miles without water and still have fight left in him. They found Storm's trail easily enough in the soft earth near the ranch buildings, deep hoof prints, showing the characteristic pattern of an unshod horse moving at speed. But following it proved increasingly treacherous as they climbed into the rocky canyon country where prints disappeared on stone surfaces, and the path became a matter of educated guesswork based on broken twigs and disturbed pebbles. Clara's feet, protected only by worn cloth shoes, never designed for such terrain, began bleeding within the first hour. Each step on the razor-sharp limestone sent jolts of fire up her legs, but she bit back her complaints. Eli was struggling just as badly, his limp becoming more pronounced as exhaustion and dehydration took their toll. Yet he never slowed his determined pace. "There." Eli pointed with his walking stick toward a distant ridge where black vultures circled lazily in the afternoon thermals. "Something's drawing them. Could be Storm found trouble with a snake or fell into a crevice." As they approached the ridge, moving carefully through a field of loose shale that could trigger a landslide, a new danger emerged from the rocks ahead. 3 coyotes materialized from the shadows, like gray ghosts, their yellow eyes fixed hungrily on the blood seeping through Clara's inadequate shoes. The pack leader, a battle-scarred male with one tattered ear, approached with the patient confidence of a predator that knew its prey was weakening with every step. "Pick up rocks," Eli said tersely, gripping his walking stick like a club while positioning himself between Clara and the advancing animals. "Anything you can throw hard and accurate. Whatever you do, don't run. They'll chase you down and hamstring you before you make it 10 yards. The lead coyote crept closer with lips pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs, while its companions spread out to flank them in a maneuver that demonstrated the pack intelligence that made them so deadly to unwary travelers. Clara's hands closed around jagged chunks of limestone, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echoing off the canyon walls. When the attack came, it was swift and perfectly coordinated. The alpha male lunged directly for Clara's throat while the other 2 moved to cut off any escape route. Eli's walking stick caught the first animal across the snout with a sickening crack of breaking bone, sending it tumbling backward into the rocks with a howl of pain and fury. Clara's thrown stones struck the second coyote in the ribs and shoulder, causing it to yelp and retreat several steps. But the third animal had circled behind them, preparing to leap at Eli's injured leg. Only his quick reflexes, honed by years of working with unpredictable horses, saved him as he spun awkwardly and drove the walking stick's iron-tipped end deep into the beast's shoulder. The wounded coyotes fled with howls that echoed through the canyon. But the encounter had cost precious time and energy they couldn't spare. Worse, the noise might have spooked Storm even farther from their location. They found shelter in a narrow ravine as the sun reached its merciless zenith, the heat becoming too dangerous for further travel until the worst of it passed. Clara's feet were raw and bloody, leaving crimson footprints on the stone, while Eli's shoulder had stiffened to the point where he could barely lift his arm above his chest. "We're not going to make it back by sunset," Clara said, voicing the obvious truth they both understood. "Even if we find Storm, we can't get him back to the ranch in time." Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the harsh landscape that surrounded them on all sides. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made Clara study his face more carefully. "There's something you need to understand," he said slowly, each word chosen with deliberate care. "About why I can't let anything happen to you. Why, I'd rather die out here than let Hawthorne get his hands on you again." Clara waited, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would fundamentally change everything between them. "My leg." Eli continued touching the permanent injury through his worn pants. "It wasn't from any horse accident like everyone assumes. I got it trying to protect someone, another girl, not much different from you. Her name was Rebecca." The story emerged in painful fragments, each word extracted like a splinter from infected flesh. Rebecca had been small and supposedly weak, like Clara relegated to the worst jobs as punishment for her perceived inadequacy. She'd made the mistake of trying to help an injured foal staying late in the stables when she should have been scrubbing floors in the main house. Hawthorne found her there. Eli's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Decided she needed a lesson about following orders. But his idea of discipline went way beyond beating. He was going to... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. She'd seen that particular hunger in Hawthorne's eyes when he hurt her. "I heard her screaming from across the yard. Went running, found him holding her down while she fought like a wildcat." Eli's hands were shaking now as the memory overwhelmed him. "I hit him with a shovel, tried to pull her away. He grabbed a hammer, smashed my leg until the bones snapped like dry kindling." Clara felt the world tilt around her as the true horror of her situation became clear. This wasn't just a ranch run by cruel employers. It was a place where murder was simply another tool of control. "What happened to Rebecca?" "He killed her," Eli said simply. "Right there in the stables with his bare hands around her throat. Told everyone afterward that she'd run off in the night, but I saw him bury her body out by the old lightning-struck oak tree beyond the north pasture." "Why didn't you tell someone, the sheriff or—" "Tell who?" Eli's laugh was bitter as alkali dust. "Sheriff Bradley comes by once a month to collect his bribe money from Mrs. Pratt. The other workers are too scared to speak up, and who's going to believe a crippled stable hand over the foreman I tried to leave once hobbled almost 10 miles before my leg gave out completely. Crawled back more dead than alive." The full magnitude of Clara's trap hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just working for abusive employers, she was imprisoned in a nightmare where people vanished without trace, and their deaths were covered up with casual efficiency. "You have to run tonight," Eli said urgently, gripping her arm with desperate intensity. "When they think we're still tracking Storm, take whatever supplies you can carry and head for the river. Follow it downstream for 3 days and you'll reach Millbrook. There's honest people there who'll help you." "What about you?" "I'll lead them in the wrong direction, buy you time to get clear of this country." His eyes held the calm acceptance of someone who'd already made peace with his fate. "My leg won't let me travel fast enough to escape, but I can slow down any pursuit." Clara stared at this man who was willing to sacrifice himself for someone he barely knew, someone the world had dismissed as worthless. In that moment, she made a decision that surprised them both. "No," she said firmly. "We're both getting out of this alive, or we're both dying together. I won't leave you behind to face Hawthorne alone." Before Eli could protest, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the ravine walls like distant thunder. They scrambled to peer over the rocky edge and saw Hawthorne leading 4 ranch hands across the scrubland below, tracking dogs ranging ahead of the mounted men with their noses to the ground. "Damn," Eli muttered grimly. "He must have borrowed those hounds from the Turner spread. They'll follow our scent even across solid rock." The men below had spotted their trail and were following it with professional efficiency that spoke of long experience hunting fugitives in this harsh country. There was nowhere to run that the dogs couldn't track, nowhere to hide that wouldn't be discovered within minutes. "Can you still swing that walking stick?" Clara asked, surprised by the steel that had crept into her own voice. Eli tested his injured shoulder experimentally and nodded grimly. "Well enough for government work. Then we make our stand here. Better to die fighting than let them drag us back for whatever they've got planned." Their defiance lasted exactly as long as it took the ranch hands to surround the ravine from both ends. Hawthorne's voice boomed down from the rim above, magnified by the stone walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Come out peaceful, and I might let you die quick and clean. Make me come down there after you, and I'll take my sweet time with both of you before I'm done." They climbed out with whatever dignity remained intact, Clara helping Eli manage the treacherous slope with his damaged leg, while the dogs snarled and strained at their leashes. Hawthorne's face was flushed with triumph and anticipation. He'd been looking forward to this moment since the day Clara had first arrived at the ranch. "Tie the cripple in the supply wagon," he ordered his men with obvious satisfaction. "Make sure those ropes are good and tight. Don't want him falling out on the rough ground. The girl walks behind my horse." Eli fought desperately as they bound his hands, earning a rifle butt to the temple that left him dazed and bleeding from a scalp wound. They loaded him into the wagon bed, like a sack of grain, while Clara was secured to a rope behind Hawthorne's mount, the coarse hemp already cutting into her waist. The journey back to the ranch was deliberate torture designed to break Clara's spirit completely before the real punishment began. Hawthorne kept his horse at a pace just fast enough to force her into a stumbling run across the broken terrain, the rope burning through her dress to cut bloody furrows in her flesh. When she fell, and she fell repeatedly as exhaustion overwhelmed her, he would drag her until she could somehow regain her footing and then continue the brutal march without pause. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, Clara's dress was in tatters, and her body looked like she'd been mauled by wild animals. The other workers watched from doorways and windows as the grim procession approached their faces, showing the sick fascination of people witnessing a public execution. Several quickly looked away or retreated inside, unwilling to meet Clara's eyes. "Gather round, everybody," Hawthorne called out as he hauled Clara into the center of the stable yard. "Time for an object lesson about what happens to horse thieves and troublemakers on the Pratt Ranch." He dragged her to a wooden post that stood in the yard's center, its surface stained dark with old blood from previous lessons. The ropes that secured her were tight enough to cut off circulation, forcing her to stand on her toes to breathe properly. Eli was dumped unceremoniously from the wagon nearby, still bound and semi-conscious from his head injury. A thin trickle of blood ran from his temple to pool in the dust beneath his face. Mrs. Pratt emerged from her house to oversee the proceedings, her cold eyes showing no more emotion than if she were watching someone shoe a horse. "Make sure they're both still breathing, come morning, foreman. Dead examples teach no lessons to the living. Oh, they'll be alive." Hawthorne promised, his voice thick with anticipation. "Might wish they weren't, but they'll be breathing when the sun comes up." As darkness fell across the ranch, Clara was left tied to the punishment post, while Eli lay motionless in the dirt nearby. The other workers retreated to their quarters early, unwilling to witness whatever was planned for dawn. Even the horses seemed to sense the approaching violence, stamping restlessly in their stalls and whinnying with nervous energy. But the Texas frontier had been suffering through its own trials that summer. The drought that had plagued the region for months had left everything bone dry and ready to burn. Grass that should have been green was brown, and brittle trees had shed their leaves early to conserve moisture, and the very air seemed to crackle with dangerous potential. When the storm finally came around midnight, it brought no blessed rain, only wind and lightning, and the kind of electrical tension that made horses pace frantically and men wake from uneasy sleep. The first bolt struck a dead cottonwood near the eastern pasture, splitting the ancient trunk down the middle with a crack like cannon fire. Sparks showered into the drought-stressed grass, and within heartbeats, the night sky was painted orange with the first hungry flames of what would become an inferno. Fire in ranch country was the ultimate terror, a force that could devour everything in its path with unstoppable fury, leaving nothing but ashes and bones in its wake. This particular blaze, fed by months of drought and driven by gusting winds that seemed to change direction every few minutes, exploded across the landscape like a living creature suddenly awakened from long slumber. Clara watched the distant glow grow brighter and felt the wind shift, carrying the acrid smell of smoke and the ominous, crackling roar of flames consuming everything they touched. In the stables, horses began screaming with primal terror, their hooves thundering against wooden walls as they sensed the approaching disaster. Storm, who had been recaptured earlier that day and returned to his reinforced pen, reared and plunged with desperate fury as the smell of smoke filled his sensitive nostrils. Hawthorne and his men emerged from the bunkhouse, their faces pale in the firelight, as they realized the full magnitude of the catastrophe bearing down on them. The flames were advancing in a line that stretched across the entire eastern horizon, moving faster than a galloping horse and consuming everything in their path. "Now get the horses." Mrs. Pratt's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "Save the valuable stock first, the rest can fend for themselves." In the panic of evacuation, as men ran in all directions, shouting contradictory orders, Clara saw her opportunity. The rope around her waist had been loosened by her struggles throughout the long day, and a protruding nail in the wooden post provided the sharp edge she desperately needed. Working frantically while everyone's attention was focused on the approaching inferno, she sawed through her bonds with desperate efficiency. The hemp fibers parted one by one until she could finally twist free her hands, already blistered and bleeding from the rough treatment. Storm was the key to everything. She understood that now with crystal clarity. In all the confusion, someone had brought him back and penned him near the stables, probably intending to use him to help evacuate the other animals. But the magnificent Mustang was beyond terrified, driven to complete madness by the smell of smoke and the increasingly loud roar of approaching flames. Clara approached his pen carefully, remembering everything Eli had taught her about reading horses' body language and the importance of moving slowly even when time was running out. Her heart hammered with fear and desperate hope as she spoke to the frantic animal. "Easy, Storm," she whispered, though she doubted he could hear her over the noise of fire and panicked horses. "We're both trapped here, but maybe we can help each other escape." The Mustang's eyes rolled white with terror foam, flecking his muzzle as he paced the confines of his pen. But something in Clara's voice or posture must have penetrated his panic, because when she unlatched the gate, he didn't immediately bolt. Instead, he stood trembling like a coiled spring, waiting to see what this small human would do next. Clara had never mounted a horse. Bareback in her life, had barely ridden at all during her sheltered upbringing. But desperation lent her strength and courage she'd never known she possessed. She pulled herself onto Storm's back, with movements born of pure necessity, feeling his powerful muscles bunch beneath her as he prepared to explode into motion. "Find Eli," she whispered directly into his ear, praying that somehow he would understand. "Help me save him." Whether Storm comprehended her words or simply recognized another trapped soul seeking freedom, he moved toward the wagon, where Eli lay bound and semi-conscious. Clara slid down and began working frantically at his restraints, with a broken piece of horseshoe she'd spotted gleaming in the dirt. The fire had reached the outer buildings, now consuming the hay barn in a pillar of flame that reached toward the star-filled sky. Burning embers began falling like deadly snow, setting small fires wherever they landed on the drought-stressed grass and wooden structures. "Our Clara." Eli's voice was weak but alert as the ropes finally parted. "The fire, how close?" "Close enough," she replied tersely, helping him stand on legs that barely supported his weight. "Can you ride bareback?" He looked at Storm with amazement and something approaching reverence. "How did you never mind? We need to move now before the wind shifts again." The Mustang seemed to understand the urgency of their situation. When Clara boosted Eli onto his back and then pulled herself up behind him, Storm launched into a gallop that carried them away from the ranch with ground-shaking power. Behind them, the main barn erupted in a tower of flame that turned night into day, while the screams of trapped animals created a hellish symphony of destruction. They rode hard across the scrubland storm's sure feet, finding safe passage even in the chaotic light of the spreading fire. The Mustang seemed to know instinctively which direction led to safety, carrying them through a maze of burning brush and fallen timber with the skill of an animal born to survive in harsh country. The heat at their backs was like the breath of a furnace, singeing their hair and clothes even at a distance. Sparks swirled around them in glowing spirals, some settling on their clothing only to be quickly brushed away before they could take hold. When they finally stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop several miles from the ranch, Clara turned to see the entire southern horizon glowing like the entrance to hell itself. Towering columns of smoke rose into the star-filled sky, blotting out whole constellations with their billowing darkness. "It's all gone," Eli said quietly, his voice mixing awe and relief in equal measure. "Everything." "Not everything," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness she heard in her own voice. "We're still here. We made it out alive. Thanks to you and Storm," Eli said, reaching forward to stroke the Mustang's neck with genuine gratitude. "I never thought I'd live to see sunrise again." Dawn revealed the true scope of the disaster that had befallen the Pratt Ranch. What had once been a sprawling complex of buildings and corrals was now a smoking wasteland of blackened timber and ash. The fire had consumed everything in its path, obliterating years of construction and the dreams, both good and evil, that had shaped the place. But something else rose with the morning sun, people. As word of the catastrophe spread throughout the surrounding area, riders began arriving from neighboring ranches and the distant town. The towering column of smoke had been visible for miles, drawing concerned neighbors and curious onlookers alike. Clara and Eli rode Storm back toward the ruins, no longer fugitives, but survivors with a story that desperately needed telling. They found Hawthorne and his surviving men gathered around Mrs. Pratt near what had been the main house, all of them soot-stained and defeated by the disaster that had destroyed their world overnight. Sheriff Tom Bradley had ridden out from the county seat, accompanied by several prominent townspeople who served as informal witnesses to frontier justice. He was a weathered man in his 50s, who'd seen enough of life to recognize truth when he heard it, regardless of who was telling the story. The foreman's eyes blazed with impotent fury when he spotted them approaching on the magnificent Mustang. "You," he snarled, pointing an accusing finger at Clara, while his face flushed purple with rage. "You set this fire, burned down the whole damn place for revenge. That's a bold-faced lie." Clara replied calmly, sliding down from Storm's back with newfound confidence that surprised everyone present. "The fire started from lightning, and every person here knows it. Besides," added old Jake Morrison, who'd escaped the flames with nothing but the clothes on his back, "I seen that first lightning bolt myself, hit that old dead cottonwood just like Clara says." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt, a gesture that wasn't lost on Hawthorne or his remaining allies. "I'd like to hear their side of the story," he said mildly. "Seems to me there might be more going on here than just a fire." What followed was the reckoning that had been building for years beneath the surface of the Pratt Ranch's carefully maintained facade. Eli, no longer the frightened stable hand who'd hidden his terrible knowledge for so long, told Sheriff Bradley everything he knew. About Rebecca's murder, about the systematic abuse that kept workers trapped and terrified, about the culture of violence that had turned the ranch into a private kingdom where human life had no value. "Those are damn lies," Hawthorne protested, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You can't believe anything that comes from a cripple and a half-wit girl." "Maybe not," Sheriff Bradley agreed with deceptive mildness. "But I reckon I can trust what I find when I dig around that lightning-struck oak tree you mentioned, son. And I can sure as hell trust the evidence of my own eyes when I look at the scars on both these young folks." Mrs. Pratt's face went white as fresh snow when the sheriff mentioned investigating Rebecca's supposed grave. For the first time since Clara had known her, the Iron Lady showed something resembling genuine fear Now, see here, Sheriff, she began in her most authoritative voice. These are wild accusations from disgruntled former employees. Surely you don't intend to— Ma'am. I intend to investigate every claim these folks have made. Bradley interrupted firmly. And if I find what I think I'm going to find, there's going to be some serious questions that need answering. The sheriff's investigation, conducted with the help of several townsmen and the blessing of other ranch workers who finally felt safe enough to speak, revealed far more than just Rebecca's unmarked grave. In the ruins of Mrs. Pratt's private office, protected by a fireproof safe that had survived the inferno, they discovered meticulously kept records that painted a picture of systematic exploitation stretching back more than a decade. There were lists of workers who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, wages that had been withheld for manufactured infractions, and most damning of all, correspondence with other ranchers about sharing information on troublesome employees who needed to be kept from finding work elsewhere. But the most shocking discovery came when they searched through Hawthorne's personal quarters. Among his belongings, carefully hidden in a secret compartment, the sheriff found a family Bible with birth records that revealed a stunning truth. Buck Hawthorne was not merely Mrs. Pratt's trusted foreman, but her illegitimate son, born 31 years earlier, to protect her reputation in a society that would have destroyed her for such a scandal. Even more devastating were the letters they found written in Mrs. Pratt's own hand, detailing her knowledge of not just Rebecca's murder, but at least 2 other killings that Hawthorne had committed over the years. The correspondence showed clearly that she had helped cover up each crime, providing alibis and disposing of evidence to protect her son from justice. Sweet, merciful Jesus. Sheriff Bradley muttered as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. She's been protecting him for decades, covering up his crimes, letting him run wild, all because she couldn't bear to lose her only child. Mrs. Pratt's confession came slowly extracted piece by piece, like poison from an infected wound. She admitted to knowing about the murders, to helping fabricate stories about workers running off, to using her influence with local authorities to ensure that no serious investigations were ever conducted. I built this place from nothing. She said, her voice hollow with the sound of complete defeat. Fought off rustlers and drought and every other curse this godforsaken country could throw at me. Buck was all I had left of the man I loved, the only good thing that ever came from those early years of struggle. So you let him kill innocent people to protect him. Clara said, her voice carrying a disgust that surprised everyone present. You turned this place into hell on earth rather than face the truth about what your son had become. He's still my blood. Mrs. Pratt whispered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. I wouldn't let them take him from me. The justice that followed was swift and uncompromising, as it had to be in a land where law often came at the end of a rope, and formal courts were sometimes days away. Both Hawthorne and Mrs. Pratt were placed under arrest and transported to the county seat to await proper trial. Their reign of terror finally ended by the flames that had consumed their evil empire. But there was one final revelation waiting, discovered only when Clara and Eli confronted the prisoners before their transport. Face to face with their former tormentors, for what would be the last time, Clara felt compelled to speak her mind. I want you to know, she told Hawthorne, her voice steady and clear, that your cruelty didn't make you strong. It made you weak, so weak that you had to hurt defenseless people to feel powerful. You think you've won something. Hawthorne snarled, his hands shackled, but his eyes still burning with hatred. You think this changes anything? There's 100 ranches just like this one, and they'll— Eli interrupted quietly. There won't be, because people are going to know what happened here, and they're going to remember. Sheriff Bradley awarded Clara and Eli substantial compensation from the ranch's remaining assets, back wages that should have been paid years earlier, plus additional damages for the suffering they had endured. It was enough money to start fresh lives anywhere they chose, far from the ashes and memories of their former prison. Storm, as if understanding that his own captivity was finally over, chose to remain with Clara. The bond forged in those desperate moments of escape had created something deeper than mere ownership, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared survival that would last for the rest of their lives. The people of the surrounding area, ashamed of their years of willful blindness to the ranch's crimes, offered both Clara and Eli honest employment and places in their communities. Clara accepted a position, assisting the town doctor, her gentle nature and steady hands, proving invaluable in caring for the sick and injured. Eli found work at the livery stable where his remarkable gift with horses was finally appreciated rather than exploited. As they stood together on the porch of Clara's new boarding house one evening, several weeks later, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eli turned to her with wonder, still evident in his eyes. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if that lightning hadn't struck when it did," he said quietly. "If we'd stayed trapped there forever." Clara reached out and took his hand, noting how different the calluses felt now that they came from honest work rather than suffering. "The lightning didn't save us," she said with quiet conviction. "We saved ourselves. The fire just cleared away all the lies so everyone else could finally see the truth." Storm nickered softly from his pen nearby, no longer truly wild, but never quite tame, either something uniquely his own that couldn't be easily categorized. Like Clara and Eli themselves, he had found a place where strength was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the courage to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In the distance, new construction was already beginning where the Pratt Ranch had once stood. But this time, things would be different. Sheriff Bradley had made certain of that, establishing oversight and regulations that would prevent another tyrant from taking root in the ashes of the old regime. Clara smiled as she watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, feeling at peace for the first time in her adult life. She had been labeled too weak to work, cast aside as worthless by those who confused cruelty with strength. But she had discovered something that the Hawthorns and Pratts of the world would never understand. And that true power came not from breaking others, but from refusing to be broken yourself. The frontier was still dangerous, still unforgiving to those who couldn't adapt and survive. But Clara faced that wildness now, not as a victim, but as someone who had earned her place through courage, loyalty, and the quiet revolution of choosing compassion in a world that too often rewarded brutality. As Eli's hand tightened around hers and Storm settled into peaceful rest, Clara knew that their story would be remembered long after the ashes of the Pratt Ranch had blown away on the desert wind. They had proven that even in the harshest circumstances, human decency could triumph over organized evil, and that sometimes the weakest among us possess a strength that no amount of violence can destroy.